every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. There is a house that sits on the south shore of Long Island, a large Dutch colonial with a gambrel roof and distinctive quarter-moon windows. To the casual observer, those windows look like a pair of watching eyes. For 50 years, those eyes have stared out at a world that, in turn, has stared right back, captivated by a story of unimaginable horror. The address is 112 Ocean Avenue, in the village of Amityville, New York. It is arguably the most famous haunted house in American history. The name Amityville itself has become a synonym for spectral malevolence. But the story that made it famous is not the story that began there. Before the alleged demonic pigs, the green slime, and the ghostly voices, there was a much more terrestrial, and therefore much more disturbing kind of evil. An evil born not of hell, but of the simmering resentments within a seemingly perfect suburban family. On the evening of November 13, 1974, a frantic young man burst through the doors of a local establishment called Henry's Bar, a short distance from the house with the watching eyes. The bar was a typical neighborhood watering hole, a place of familiar faces and easy conversation. The sudden intrusion of raw panic shattered the calm. The man was 23-year-old Ronald DeFeo Jr., known to everyone as Butch. He was hysterical, screaming, "You gotta help me. I think my mother and father are shot." The patrons, many of whom knew Butch, were initially stunned, some perhaps skeptical of the notoriously volatile young man. But his terror was palpable. A small group, including his close friend Bobby Kelsky, agreed to go with him. They walked the short distance to his family home. As they approached, the house was dark and silent. There was nothing to suggest the carnage that lay within. Upon entering, the group was met with a scene that would become the bedrock of a legend, a tableau of violence so silent and so baffling that it would leave investigators questioning the very laws of physics. Inside, 6 people were dead. The patriarch, Ronald DeFeo Sr., 43, his wife, Louise, 43, and 4 of their 5 children, Don, 18, Allison, 13, Mark, 12, and John Matthew, 9. All of them, with the exception of Louise, were found lying face down in their beds, victims of a high-powered .35 caliber Marlin lever-action rifle. There were no signs of a struggle. No ripped bedsheets, no overturned furniture. The scene was eerily, unnaturally still. The coroner would later find no sedatives in their systems. This presented an immediate and terrifying paradox. How could 8 shots from a powerful hunting rifle, a weapon that produces a sound blast of over 160 decibels, louder than a jet engine at takeoff, be fired inside a wood frame house without a single neighbor hearing a thing? And more chillingly, how did it happen without a single victim after the first thunderous shot, waking up to the sound of their own family being slaughtered? This case is a story told in 2 acts, a bifurcated narrative that has become a pillar of American folklore. The first is a straightforward, albeit brutal, true crime investigation into a familicide. The second is a cultural ghost story that would generate millions of dollars and define a genre for decades to come. The lines between these 2 tales have blurred over time, creating a modern myth where fact and fiction are almost indistinguishable. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a haunting. We will strip away the supernatural folklore to examine the cold, hard mechanics of the crime itself, the dysfunctional family, the troubled killer, and the perplexing forensic questions that still linger. Then, we will turn our scalpel to the legend that followed, analyzing how a story of ghosts and demons, grew from the blood-soaked floorboards of 112 Ocean Avenue, and asking which version of the Amityville horror is truly the more terrifying one. To understand the explosion of violence that occurred on November 13, 1974, you must first understand the immense, suffocating pressure that had been building inside the DeFeo household for years. From the outside, they were the embodiment of the American dream. Ronald DeFeo Jr., known to all as Big Ronnie, was a successful and commanding figure, the service manager at a Brooklyn Buick dealership owned by his powerful father-in-law. Michael Briganti Sr., Big Ronnie, was a man who provided his family with all the material trappings of success. A beautiful, sprawling home in a respectable waterfront neighborhood, a pristine swimming pool for hot summer days, and a sleek speedboat docked in the canal behind the house. But this idyllic facade, like a poorly constructed movie set, concealed a rotting and volatile reality. Big Ronnie ruled his home not as a father, but as a despot. He was a man of fierce pride and a notoriously short fuse, and he maintained control through fear and intimidation. His word was law, and any perceived disrespect was met with a terrifying display of verbal or physical aggression. He was particularly hard on his eldest son and namesake, Butch. The relationship between father and son was a toxic crucible of abuse, expectation, and resentment. Big Ronnie saw Butch as a disappointment, a soft and lazy boy who failed to live up to his own demanding standards. He subjected Butch to relentless criticism and, by many accounts, severe beatings. Yet, in a bizarre contradiction, he also showered Butch with unearned privileges, including a high-paying, largely no-show job at the dealership, and a weekly allowance that would be the envy of any young man his age. This dynamic created a deeply unhealthy codependency. Butch was simultaneously a victim of his father's abuse and a beneficiary of his father's wealth. He was trapped in a gilded cage, financially enabled by the very person who tormented him. In response, Butch mirrored the aggression he endured. He was overweight and heavily bullied at school, which only fueled his simmering rage. By his late teens, he had retreated into a dangerous world of substance abuse, experimenting heavily with LSD and developing a serious, costly heroin addiction. He projected an image of a tough guy, a swaggering figure who was quick to anger and prone to violence himself. He became obsessed with guns, collecting them and often carrying them, a clear and dangerous reflection of the power he felt he lacked in his own home. Their arguments were legendary in the family, often escalating into full-blown physical brawls that left both men bruised and the house in a state of disarray. The rest of the family existed in the turbulent orbit of this central, destructive conflict. Louise DeFeo, the matriarch, was a woman caught in an impossible position. She had grown up in a powerful family and was known for her beauty and her devotion to her children. She often played the role of peacemaker, desperately trying to soothe her husband's explosive temper and shield her children from the worst of his wrath. But she was also a victim herself, enduring Big Ronnie's verbal tirades and, according to some reports, his physical abuse. She struggled to maintain a veneer of normalcy, to hold the family together, but the tension was a constant, oppressive presence in the home, an unspoken truth that everyone was forced to navigate. The younger children, Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John Matthew, were largely caught in the crossfire of their father's rage and their brother's instability. Dawn, the eldest daughter at 18, was said to have her own contentious relationship with her father. She was fiercely protective of her younger siblings, and was reportedly the only one who could occasionally stand up to Big Ronnie. 13-year-old Allison was described by friends as the sweet, religious heart of the family, a gentle soul who found solace in her faith. The two youngest boys, 12-year-old Mark and 9-year-old John, were inseparable. Mark was known to have some health issues that made him the focus of Louise's protective instincts, while John was a typical, energetic young boy. They were, by all accounts, innocent children, forced to grow up in a war zone, insulated only by their youth from the worst of the household's deep-seated dysfunction. Yet, no one was truly safe from the psychological fallout. The poison of Big Ronnie and Butch's relationship seeped into every corner of 112 Ocean Avenue. In the weeks leading up to the murders, the already immense pressure inside the home intensified to a breaking point. Butch's drug use was spiraling out of control, and his behavior became increasingly erratic and paranoid. The fights with his father grew more frequent and more violent. There was a major dispute over a sum of money, around $20,000, that Butch was supposed to deposit for the dealership, but had allegedly orchestrated a fake robbery to steal with a friend. In another incident, a furious argument between father and son culminated in Butch grabbing a shotgun and pointing it at his father, with Louise having to step between them to prevent a tragedy. This was not a household on the verge of collapse. It was a household that was actively collapsing. On Tuesday, November 12th, the day before the killings, Butch was involved in the very theft scheme he had planned. When he failed to make the bank deposit, he knew a final, terrible confrontation with his father was inevitable. He later told friends that he had to get out, that he couldn't take it anymore. He was a powder keg, and the fuse, burning for years, was now just inches from the charge. That evening, Butch left the house and spent several hours with friends, drinking, doing drugs, and trying to build an alibi for the theft. He made several attempts to call home, but the line was always busy. Around 3 a.m. on Wednesday, November 13th, he returned to 112 Ocean Avenue. What happened next has been the subject of debate and Butch's own changing stories for decades, but the forensic evidence tells a grim and relatively clear story. Armed with his Marlin rifle, Butch DeFeo Jr. began a systematic extermination of his own family. The prosecution argued that he went to his parents' master bedroom first. He shot his father twice, the first bullet entering the base of his neck and severing his spinal cord, the second striking him in the kidney. He then turned the rifle on his mother, firing 2 shots into her chest and abdomen. Both were killed instantly. From there, he moved through the house with a chilling and methodical efficiency. He went to the room shared by his 2 youngest brothers, Mark and John. He fired a single, fatal shot into each of them as they slept. Mark was shot once in the spine. John was shot once in the back. Finally, he went to the second-floor bedroom shared by his sisters. He shot Allison once in the head and Dawn once in the neck. All 6 victims were found lying on their stomachs, a detail that has puzzled investigators for years. Was it a coincidence, or did Butch reposition the bodies? The latter seems unlikely given the timeline and lack of disturbance. It's more probable that this was simply how they slept, a final, tragic happenstance in a night deafen. Ed by brutal intent. After the slaughter was complete, Butch took a shower, gathered his bloody clothes and the rifle, stuffing them into a pillowcase. He then drove away from the house and disposed of the evidence in a storm drain in Brooklyn before heading to his phantom job at the dealership, ready to begin the performance of a grieving son. The initial hours of the Suffolk County Police investigation were a whirlwind of confusion and dawning horror. When detectives arrived at 112 Ocean Avenue, they were met with a scene of almost theatrical carnage. The bodies were discovered in their respective bedrooms on the second floor, each in their own bed, tucked under the covers as if they were merely sleeping. The lack of any sign of a struggle was profoundly unsettling. Detective Gerard Gozoloff, one of the first officers on the scene, noted the profound, unnatural silence of the house, a quiet that seemed to mock the terrible violence that had occurred within its walls. The only survivor, Butch DeFeo, the distraught son who had discovered the scene, was immediately the focus of their attention. He was taken to the police station for what was initially considered a routine witness interview. His first story was a shaky and transparent fabrication, designed to point the finger of blame elsewhere. He claimed he had left for work unusually early that morning, around 4 a.m., because he couldn't sleep. He spent the day trying and failing to contact his family. He suggested the murders were a professional mob hit, possibly connected to his grandfather, or a shadowy figure named Louis Fellini, a man he claimed had a grudge against the family and had once threatened him. Detectives listened patiently as Butch spun his tale, but the narrative was riddled with inconsistencies. His timeline didn't add up. His demeanor, a strange and unconvincing mix of feigned grief and detached calm, raised immediate suspicions. The lead detective, John Rafferty, a seasoned investigator, sensed that Butch knew far more than he was letting on. Butch's story felt rehearsed, hollow. For hours, the interrogation continued at the station house. Detectives employed a classic good cop, bad cop strategy, with some officers offering sympathy for his loss, while others relentlessly poked holes in his story. They questioned him about his drug use, his volatile relationship with his father, and his extensive knowledge of firearms. A key turning point came when they began pressing him on the details of his .35 caliber Marlin rifle. They knew from the shell casings found at the scene that a Marlin had been used in the killings. Butch admitted to owning such a weapon, but claimed he couldn't remember where it was, suggesting a friend might have borrowed it. The detectives zeroed in. They had already searched his room and found an empty box for Marlin ammunition. The circumstantial evidence was tightening around him like a noose. They knew he was lying. It was just a matter of when he would break. The break came after nearly a full day of intense questioning. An officer, frustrated with the lies, pointedly asked Butch how it was possible that his entire family could have been shot and killed without him being in the house as he initially claimed, hearing anything. The logic was inescapable. The lie was too big to sustain. Cornered, exhausted, and likely coming down from a drug high, Butch DeFeo Jr. finally abandoned the act. In a calm, almost matter-of-fact tone that chilled the experienced detectives, he confessed. He said, "It all started so fast. Once I started, I just couldn't stop. It went so fast." He then provided a detailed, horrifying account of the massacre, walking the detectives through the house room by room, victim by victim. He described shooting his parents first, then his brothers, and finally his sisters. He even led them to the very storm drain in Brooklyn where he had discarded the rifle and his blood-soaked clothing. However, this initial confession would not be his final word on the matter. In the months and years that followed, as he sat in jail awaiting trial and then serving his sentence, Butch DeFeo's story would contort and change with a dizzying frequency. Each new version seemed calculated to shift blame, garner sympathy, or simply create chaos. At one point, he claimed his sister Dawn was a key participant, alleging that she had killed their father, and that he, in a blind rage, had then killed everyone else, including her. This theory gained some traction in conspiracy circles, because unburnt gunpowder was found on Dawn's nightgown. However, forensic experts for the prosecution convincingly argued it was simply transfer, or blowback from the close-range blast of the rifle, not from her firing a weapon. He later claimed multiple accomplices were present, that friends, or even his own mother, had helped him carry out the slaughter, a claim for which he could never produce a shred of credible evidence. But his most persistent and consequential claim, the one that would form the basis of his legal defense, was that he heard voices. He alleged that sinister, disembodied commands from unseen entities had compelled him to kill, that he was not in control of his own actions. This was the first seed of the supernatural narrative that would later consume the case, a narrative that his own defense attorney would help cultivate into a national phenomenon. The trial of Ronald DeFeo Jr. began in October 1975, and it was a media circus. His court-appointed attorney, William Weber, was a flamboyant and ambitious lawyer faced with a seemingly impossible task. The evidence against his client was overwhelming. He had confessed the murder weapon was his, and his alibi was non-existent. Weber's only viable strategy was an affirmative defense of insanity. He argued that Butch, the product of years of brutal abuse and warped by heavy drug use, had slipped into a dissociative state on the night of the murders. The defense's psychiatrist, Dr. Daniel Schwartz, testified that DeFeo was suffering from a paranoid personality disorder. He claimed Butch was acting in what he perceived as self-defense, responding to auditory hallucinations of his family members plotting against him. The prosecution, led by the sharp and methodical Assistant District Attorney Gerard Sullivan, painted a very different picture. They portrayed Butch not as a madman, but as a cold, calculating, and greedy killer. They presented evidence that Butch stood to gain significantly from his parents' deaths, specifically from a life insurance policy valued at over $200,000. A substantial sum in 1974. They argued that the methodical nature of the killings, moving from room to room, executing his entire family as they slept, was not the act of a man lost in a psychotic rage, but of a remorseless predator methodically eliminating obstacles. Their star psychiatric witness, Dr. Harold Zolan, testified that while DeFeo certainly had an antisocial personality disorder and was a habitual drug user, he was fully aware of his actions on the night of the murders and understood that they were wrong. He was, in the doctor's professional opinion, legally sane. The jury agreed. On November 21, 1975, they found Ronald DeFeo Jr. guilty on 6 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 6 concurrent terms of 25 years to life, ensuring he would almost certainly die in prison. For the justice system, the case was closed, but for the house at 112 Ocean Avenue, the story was just beginning. For 13 months after the convictions, the house sat empty, a silent monument to the tragedy it had hosted. It became a local curiosity, a place where teenagers would dare each other to approach the door. The price was slashed. It was a beautiful, spacious home in a prime location, but it was tainted by an evil that no amount of fresh paint could cover. In December of 1975, a young couple, George and Kathy Lutz, decided they could look past the home's grim history. Along with Kathy's 3 children from a previous marriage, Daniel, Christopher, and Melissa, they purchased their dream home for the astonishingly low price of $80,000. They were fully aware of the murders. The seller's real estate agent had been upfront about the property's dark past, but the deal was too good to pass up. They moved in on December 18th, ready to start a new life. 28 days later, on January 14, 1976, they fled in terror, leaving behind all their furniture and possessions, claiming the house was possessed by a malevolent, demonic force too powerful to combat. The story the Lutzes told was a Hollywood horror script come to life, a meticulously detailed catalog of paranormal torment. Their tale began almost immediately. On the day they moved in, they asked a Catholic priest, Father Ralph Pecoraro, given the pseudonym Father Mancuso in subsequent books and films, to bless the home. According to their account, as the priest entered the upstairs bedroom that had belonged to Mark and John DeFeo and began to sprinkle holy water, he was overcome by a chilling sensation. He allegedly heard a deep, masculine, and unseen voice command, "Get out." The priest, profoundly shaken, supposedly told the Lutzes to avoid using that room as a bedroom, but he did not elaborate on his terrifying experience at the time. Later, he allegedly developed a high fever, and painful stigmatique blisters erupted on his hands. This incident was the opening salvo in what the Lutzes described as a month-long siege by the supernatural. The paranormal phenomena escalated rapidly and bizarrely. They claimed the house was constantly plagued by swarms of houseflies, even in the dead of winter when such insects should have been dormant. Unexplained cold spots would appear and disappear throughout the house, so intense they could see their breath. Strange, foul odors would permeate the air, ranging from a cloying, sickly sweet perfume to the stench of excrement. Black stains inexplicably appeared on the toilets and would resist all attempts to be cleaned. A strange green, gelatinous slime was said to ooze from the walls in the hallway and from keyholes. George Lutz began undergoing a disturbing physical and psychological transformation. He became sullen, angry, and withdrawn, mirroring the abusive personality of Big Ronnie DeFeo. He neglected his work and his appearance, and he developed a constant, bone-deep chill that no fire could warm. Most famously, he claimed he began waking up every single morning at exactly 3:15 a.m., a time they later asserted corresponded with the DeFeo murders, though this specific time was never actually established by investigators in the original case. The activity, as they described it, grew more overt and more personal. Kathy Lutz claimed to have vivid nightmares about the murders. Seeing the crimes play out in horrific detail, she began to feel the presence of an unseen entity and said she was once embraced by this invisible force. On another occasion, she claimed to have levitated several inches off her bed as she slept. Her face, she asserted, briefly and terrifyingly transformed into that of an old, hag-like woman, a moment her husband allegedly witnessed in horror. The children were also tormented. Their youngest daughter, 5-year-old Melissa, developed an imaginary friend named Jody, whom she described as a demonic pig-like creature with glowing red eyes that would appear outside her bedroom window, leaving cloven hoof prints in the snow. The family also discovered a small, hidden space in the basement, painted entirely red, which they dubbed the Red Room. They claimed their dog, Harry, refused to go near it, and that it felt like a gateway to hell itself. The climax of their ordeal supposedly occurred on their final night in the house, when they were subjected to a terrifying cacophony of banging sounds, moving furniture, and shadowy figures, forcing them to grab only what they were wearing and flee into the night, never to return. The Lutzes' story was a media powder keg waiting for a match. They soon connected with a writer, Jay Anson, and in 1977, his book, The Amityville Horror, was published. It became an instant, runaway bestseller, captivating a public hungry for tales of the supernatural, especially in a decade that had already seen the massive cultural impact of films like The Exorcist. The book was presented not as fiction, but as a true story, a factual, day-by-day account of the family's harrowing 28 days. In 1979, the film adaptation was released, and it was a box office smash, cementing the house with the eye-like windows as an indelible icon of American horror. The story also attracted the attention of the era's most famous paranormal investigators, Ed and Lorraine Warren. They visited the house in March 1976 with a camera crew from a local television station, conducting a highly publicized seance. It was during this investigation that one of their team's photographers, Gene Campbell, set up an automatic infrared camera on the second floor. One of the images captured that night has become legendary in paranormal circles. It appears to show a small boy with dark hair and glowing white eyes peering out from a doorway. For believers, this was the ultimate proof, a genuine photograph of a ghost, perhaps the spirit of the murdered 9-year-old John Matthew DeFeo. The Amityville legend was now complete, seemingly backed by eyewitnesses, a best-selling book, a hit movie, and now photographic evidence. But almost as quickly as the legend was built, its foundation began to crumble under the weight of scrutiny. Skeptics, journalists, and investigators began to pick apart the Lutz's story, and what they found was a disturbing pattern of inconsistencies, exaggerations, and outright fabrications. The first and most damning revelation came from an unlikely and explosive source. William Weber, the defense attorney for Ronald DeFeo Jr., in the years following the book's publication, a bitter falling out over money led Weber to come forward with a bombshell claim. He alleged that the entire haunting story was a hoax that he had personally concocted with George and Kathy Lutz. He stated, quite plainly, "We created this horror story over many bottles of wine." According to Weber, the motive was a cynical blend of greed and legal strategy. It was a chance to make a lot of money from a book and movie deal, and Weber hoped that a story about a demonically possessed house could lend credence to DeFeo's claim of hearing voices, potentially paving the way for a new trial based on supernatural influence. Weber provided specific details of their alleged brainstorming sessions, claiming they took the known facts of the DeFeo case and embellished them with classic horror tropes. Weber's claims were substantiated by a mountain of conflicting evidence uncovered by researchers like Stephen Kaplan, a paranormal investigator and sociologist who dedicated years to debunking the case. Kaplan's book, The Amityville Horror Conspiracy, systematically dismantled the Lutz's narrative, point by point. For instance, the Lutz's claimed to have found giant, cloven hoof prints belonging to the demonic pig Jody in the snow outside the house. Kaplan checked meteorological records for Amityville for January 1976 and found there was no snowfall during that period to record any prints. They claimed to have repeatedly called Father Pecoraro for help, but phone records obtained from the rectory showed no such calls during their 28-day stay. The priest himself, while acknowledging he visited the house and felt an unusual presence, gave conflicting and often vague accounts of his experience over the years, and many of his more dramatic claims were directly contradicted by officials from his own diocese. Dozens of other claims crumbled under basic fact-checking. The infamous Red Room in the basement was not a sinister portal to hell, but a small, dry storage space common to homes in the area that was simply located behind some shelves, a remnant from a previous owner. The Suffolk County Police Department had no record of the Lutzes ever calling them to report paranormal disturbances, despite George Lutz's claim that he had. The extensive physical damage described in the book, a front door ripped from its hinges, a marble lion statue broken, a smashed banister, was not present when the next family, the Cromartys, moved in. The Cromartys lived in the house for 10 years and reported no supernatural events whatsoever. They did, however, report being constantly harassed by tourists, ghost hunters, and pranksters drawn by the legend the Lutzes had created. It also came to light that the Lutz family was in significant financial distress before moving into the house, and the book and movie deals were not just a lucky break. They were a financial salvation. Even the famous Ghost Boy photograph was eventually challenged, with many researchers concluding that the figure was likely one of the living investigators. Paul Bartz, whose balding head and dark eyes, captured by the high-contrast infrared film, created the illusion of a ghostly child. In the final analysis, the Amityville case presents us with two distinct and competing horrors. The first is the corporeal horror of November 13, 1974. It is the story of Ronald DeFeo Jr., a deeply disturbed young man who, driven by a toxic cocktail of familial abuse, debilitating drug addiction, and profound personal rage, methodically murdered his entire family. This horror is tangible, grounded in forensic evidence, ballistics reports, and psychological profiling. It is a chilling reminder of the violence that can erupt from behind the closed doors of a seemingly normal suburban home, the perplexing questions that remain, the silence of the rifle shots, the placid state of the victims, are mysteries of physics, acoustics, and circumstance, not of the supernatural. The verdict rendered by the court stands as the factual conclusion to this chapter. It was a human act of mass murder, committed for complex but ultimately human reasons. The second horror is more insidious and, in some ways, more culturally significant. It is the story of what happened next. It is the tale of how a genuine, profound tragedy was alchemized into a multi-million-dollar ghost story. The Lutz family, whether they initially experienced some unsettling events in a creepy old house or not, participated in the creation of a narrative that was far more lucrative than the truth. Aided by an ambitious defense lawyer looking for a novel legal angle, and a public primed for supernatural tales in the wake of 1970s occult fascination, they built a global entertainment franchise on the graves of the DeFeo family. This is the horror of exploitation, of the commodification of human suffering. The book and the subsequent films transformed 112 Ocean Avenue from a crime scene into a tourist attraction, and the DeFeo victims from people into plot devices, their real lives and violent deaths reduced to backstory for a ghost story. The true anatomy of this case, therefore, is not the anatomy of a haunting, but the anatomy of a modern myth. It serves as a powerful and enduring case study in how our culture processes tragedy and how easily established fact can be supplanted by a more compelling fiction. The story of demonic forces and ghostly apparitions was, for many, more palatable, and certainly more entertaining than the grim reality of a son killing his parents, his brothers, and his sisters. The haunting narrative provided a supernatural scapegoat, absolving the public of the need to confront the complex and uncomfortable realities of domestic violence, mental illness, and addiction. It is a testament to the irresistible power of storytelling to shape belief and memory on a mass scale. The world remembers 112 Ocean Avenue for the ghosts that were never there, while the 6 silent victims, a father, a mother, 2 sons and 2 daughters, risk becoming ghosts themselves, their real and tragic end eclipsed by a fiction far more famous than the truth. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.
did I